Hey, it's Dave, and welcome back to Zilog and Moto, the show where I play and review all the 8 and 16-bit Sega games, so you don't have to. I mean, unless you see one of these reviews and you decide you want to, that is, I suppose that's the point of a review, right? Anyway, we're back this week playing a game for the Genesis that actually had 3 different incarnations. Previously, in Season 1, in Episode 17, I looked at Electronic Arts' original NHL Hockey. And then in episode 20, I followed that up with a look at EA Hockey, which was EA's international version of NHL Hockey with a different paint job, transforming NHL teams into countries' national teams to get around licensing issues with NHL. And I do mean just a different paint job, as the rosters from the NHL teams were unchanged. But since everyone only went by uniform number, it wasn't quite so obvious that Mario Lemieux and Jaromir Jagr were secretly playing for the Soviet Union. World Trophy Soccer, on the other hand, has 2 alternate versions, as it's known by European Club Soccer in, well, Europe, and J-League Championship Soccer in Japan. Or perhaps it's more appropriate to say that World Trophy Soccer is an alternate version of European Club Soccer, as that's where the game originated. European Club Soccer was developed by Chrysalis Software and released by Virgin Interactive in July of 1992, and then later ported as World Trophy Soccer that we're talking about today, 2 months later in the United States. And then finally, J-League Champion Soccer appeared in February of 1993 in an even more stripped-down form. Developer Chrysalis Software you might not be immediately familiar with if you live in the United States, because they were a British software company and actually produced all sorts of games for various European-based home computers before transitioning to Sega consoles as well. Due to this, you can technically draw a line from World Trophy Soccer back one step further, as European Club Soccer had its basis in a previous Chrysalis release, Manchester United Europe, specifically the Amiga version. However, to be clear, the game being reviewed today is World Trophy Soccer and not European Club Soccer, even if they both come from the same source. Why is that important? Well, because European Club Soccer is a massive game in scope. In European Club Soccer, fictional versions of 164 club teams from 32 European countries are present, and any of them can be chosen to compete in either a tournament or exhibition play. Having 164 teams in a sports game on a console was pretty unheard of at the time. About the closest thing I can compare it to is John Madden Football 93 Champion Edition, which featured 40 all-time teams, but even that pales in comparison. World Trophy Soccer is not European Club Soccer in that regard. Rather than the ridiculously large list of club teams that Europe got, the decision was made to remove all of those teams and instead substitute the 32 national teams that appeared in the 1990 World Cup. Now, I understand why they did this, because certainly in the United States in 1992, most people were barely familiar with the World Cup, much less major European soccer clubs. So a game featuring those teams would be a harder sell. But looking at this through a 2020 lens, this is a disaster, as this game was effectively neutered of its largest selling point. Did replacing the teams and reducing the scope of the game totally ruin it? Or is that change more or less inconsequential, and its value is more based on its gameplay and other features, or lack thereof? Well, we'll take a look at all that, but first, a look at the package. And this is World Trophy Soccer. Starting out looking at the case, this case is in decent shape, but it's definitely seen better days. I've tried to clean it up a bit, but you can definitely still see some scratching on the outer cover on both the front and the back. But all of the actual plastic is intact, with no rips and tears anywhere, and the hang tab is still attached as well. Thankfully, the inner cover is intact, with no water damage or sun bleaching. There was some dirt that got into the protective cover, which caused a tiny bit of odd wear if you actually remove the insert, but after cleaning, that's more or less imperceptible through the clear cover. As far as the front cover goes, I actually like this artwork. I'm not a big fan of the black background at the top, but the logo looks nice, and the artwork at the bottom is colorful and eye-catching. The Genesis logo looks a bit out of place right in the middle of the image, though. I don't know what's up with that. However, just like the game itself, apparently the US got watered-down cover art, as the European cover for European Club Soccer looks much better, with taking up the entire front and an even better logo. I suppose at least we didn't get the art used for J-League Champion Soccer, which flat out sucks. I'm kind of surprised that the one version of the game that actually had a proper league affiliation ended up with the worst looking product. But I guess whatever money they paid for licensing fees ate up the design budget. Flipping over to the back, and this layout is definitely a bit rough. It wouldn't be so bad if they didn't go with 4 different font colors. The biggest problem is the fact that the font at the top uses a dark red, and then the middle section with all the bullet points uses more of an orange color. Using the dark red at the top makes the text difficult to read, and I just don't understand how something like that actually gets approved from a design perspective. The screenshots in the middle are good quality, but the 2 action shots are blown up significantly to show detail, so you never get a true image of what the game actually looks like on the package, which isn't good. Showing a screenshot of true in-game action is a pretty basic thing to include on any game. The bullet points in the middle are actually laid out really well, and do a good job of selling the game and actually making it seem better than it actually is, even to the point of fibbing a bit. There's a line here, arcade or simulation style play, and this appears to just be referring to how the game labels a single game exhibition versus playing in the 32-team tournament. There's no actual difference to the gameplay between those 2 modes, so calling that a difference between an arcade or simulation style is more than a bit of a stretch. Opening the box up, and the manual is a bit beat up, but intact, similar to the outer cover. As I'll get to in the review, the game is relatively simple, especially since this version has been drastically cut down from a team's perspective. But the manual still does a decent job of explaining the game and all of the options. I say decent because it's certainly not perfect, and there's small details that have been left out, or things that have been covered in better detail, such as explaining the aggregate system used in tournament mode. Okay, that's the package for World Trophy Soccer. Let's move on to the game itself and see where this one landed for me. Anytime a game gets ported from one platform to another, there's going to be some odd idiosyncrasies that pop up. Obviously, the less of those, the better, and it shows more of an effort to make the port on the developer side, rather than just delivering a quick and dirty to the publisher to maximize profits. I figured I'd go ahead and mention one of those at the top, and it's the inclusion of the kit customization option from the original European Club Soccer. In soccer terms, a kit is the team's uniform, and consists of the design of the player's shorts, shirts, and socks. When playing a sports game with pro teams, like the original European Club Soccer, I could see wanting this option, because pro teams have things like alternate special uniforms, so maybe you'd want to go in and set your team to use a color scheme that's more in line with one of those because you prefer it. However, national teams don't tend to change their uniforms much. Go look at a picture of Pele playing for the Brazilian national team from 50 years ago, and compare it to the current Brazilian uniform. Nothing's changed other than the small details. It's still yellow shirts with blue shorts and green details. National team uniforms tend to be much more iconic than pro sports teams, which rely more on marketing and take their inspiration from their country's flag. In other words, yes, the game gives me the option to change the uniform colors of, say, the United States to run out on the field with orange tops and red shorts, but why would you ever want to? While it's a cool option to have, I think it would have been better if the developers had to focus on other elements of the game, which clearly need help. I'd mentioned a bit previously about the actual scope of World Trophy Soccer, or what the US ended up with after being converted from European Club Soccer. But specifically, the game has 2 modes, the somewhat oddly named Arcade Mode and Simulation Mode. I really don't understand why they went with these names, as they aren't accurate at all, and this is actually a flaw that goes back to the original European Club Soccer. Usually in games that feature a so-called Arcade Mode or Simulation Mode, one version of the game is high scoring and features a lot of action, hence the name arcade, and then the other is more lower scoring and tries to more accurately reflect what it's like to play and watch the game in real life. For example, with a soccer title, Arcade Mode would probably end up with a score like 10-6 or something like that, versus Simulation Mode ending up with a score like 2-1. And this is a pretty common thing in sports games and racing titles, although I suppose perhaps in 1992 it wasn't as widespread. However, World Trophy Soccer instead uses arcade mode to refer to what most other sports games would call exhibition, being just a single one-on-one match of one team versus another, and simulation mode to refer to what other games would call tournament mode, featuring a series of matches, often in ladder style. It's confusing, especially because, as I mentioned before, there's no functional difference between the two modes, and when watching gameplay, unless you knew which mode the player chose, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. As far as the modes go, arcade mode serves as a proper exhibition as you would expect, and you can pick any one team to play another, either you against the computer or a competition with a friend on the second controller. However, the meat of the game involves simulation mode, which consists of a tournament of all 32 teams included in the game. The tournament confuses me a bit because it's just a standard 32-team single elimination ladder tournament, albeit with the caveat that each round has the teams playing a home and away game, with the winner being decided by aggregate score. Americans probably aren't as familiar with this style as it's primarily used in European soccer leagues, but essentially the teams play two games, and even if a team loses the first match, if they outscore the other team in the second match by enough goals to have a higher overall total, they win the round and move on. The reason why this mode confuses me is because it's a straight ladder, and if they were modeling it after the European Cup, or the Champions League as it's known now, that tournament is not a straight ladder, instead going to a pool format after the first few rounds. Also, what would have made more sense, since World Trophy Soccer features 32 national teams, would have been for the simulation mode to feature a tournament that mirrors the World Cup. And then they didn't do that either, instead just bringing over the original tournament format. I guess to sum up, I can't decide if Chrysalis Software was incompetent or just lazy in this instance. I'm probably being a bit harsh here, as the tournament mode does work just fine if that's what you're going for, and the ability to have up to 8 people pick teams to compete against the computer or each other in the ladder is pretty cool. And the game features a password system to be able to pick up where you left off, which is good because even in one-player mode, I doubt anyone would be playing 12 matches back to back to back. Battery backup would have been even better, but I'm not going to knock a 1992 release too much for not having it. For an instance where I am going to call the developer lazy, the presentation of the various teams' skill levels is incredibly lacking, and by incredibly lacking, I mean absolutely non-existent. While you can go into the game and customize the uniforms for each team, what you can't do is see how good the players are on each team, or at very least, see how the teams are rated in a specific skill on the whole. And the teams definitely do have ratings. Chrysalis just neglected to publish those ratings anywhere. I even would have been fine if they weren't included in the actual game as long as they were in a section of the manual, but no, we didn't even get that. Due to that, it's impossible to tell just how difficult an opponent is going to be, or perhaps what teams you should consider choosing based on your playstyle. For instance, the first time I booted up World Trophy Soccer, I chose the United States, and I believe my opponent was Argentina. Well, this was a mistake as I soon found out, because the computer proceeded to destroy me 16-0, and that was just playing a 10-minute game. Now, that deficit wasn't just because of the difference in skill level between the US team and the Argentines, as part of the problem was I wasn't really familiar with how to play the game yet. But had I known just how much better rated the Argentinian team was in the US, I probably wouldn't have let off with that particular exercise in frustration. For all video games, it's important to have sharp, responsive controls, and in sports games, not only do those controls need to feel accurate, they need to make you feel like you're playing the actual sport in question. And depending on the game, sometimes having simpler controls works fine, say for instance, NBA Jam. World Trophy Soccer definitely goes down that simpler control route. The A button can be used if you want to manually choose when you switch players, but by default, the computer will switch players for you to the person closest to the ball. And this works pretty well when you get used to it. One note here is that even if you go the manual route, you will never control the goalie, as he is always controlled by the computer, even when you throw or kick the ball out of the goal to another player. This feels incredibly odd to me. I don't mind not controlling the goalie on defense, But not being able to control where the goalie sends the ball up the field is pretty awkward, and you end up essentially having to react to your own player, just like you react to your opponent. The B and C buttons are what allow you to use for the bulk of the time playing the game, and they're used to either kick the ball low or high, and then also perform different types of tackles when on defense. Unfortunately, soccer is a game that is really based on the ability to pass the ball around to different players, and attempting to pass in the game is a total crapshoot. Sometimes passes move up the field very crisply, and other times your player will either pass the ball in a direction you didn't intend, or you'll kick the ball and the computer will end up running away from the ball before you can get to control to field the pass. Compounding this problem is the computer is very good at tackling the ball away from you, so often you'll find yourself attempting to pass the ball quicker than normal, which invariably leads to more errant passes. If the passing in the game was a bit crisper, I wouldn't have a problem with this, as it does make you feel like you want to pass the ball more to work your way up the field, giving the game a more realistic feel. Unfortunately, it ends up becoming pretty frustrating, and even more so when a worse team is playing a better team, and you need everything to go right to eke out a victory. From a graphical perspective, World Trophy Soccer is decent, but it's not anything anyone would consider mind-blowing. I like the horizontal presentation for the pitch, and I like how the stands in the stadium and the bench areas are designed, with a decent amount of detail in each. The camera is far back enough to where you can see enough of the field to know what's going on, without being too far, which allows the player sprites, while being on the small side, to still have a decent amount of detail in their uniform colors and numbers on the back of their jerseys. Each player on the team is identical other than those numbers, which is a little disappointing, but at least they were smart enough to make the skin tones and hair different, depending on which country was chosen. For a 1992 title, World Trophy Soccer could have definitely looked better, but I'm not taking points away for how it looks, as it certainly could have been worse. Finally, a quick note about the audio, which I have to mention because I think the audio is probably the best part of the game. Admittedly, it doesn't have a ton of sound effects, which is to be expected, as how many different ways can a player kicking a ball sound, but the ones it does have sound good. More importantly though, the game music is pretty great. When playing a game, you might eventually get tired of the music, just because you'll be hearing the same song for however long you have the game time set to, but the actual tracks sound great, with some crisp instrumentation. It just would have been nice if the tracks varied a bit during the game to mix things up. All in all, I'm giving World Trophy Soccer 2 stars out of 5, and I think that's being generous. Knowing that the original European Club Soccer had almost 170 teams definitely hurts the game, but as I've seen others point out, 1992 was only 3 years into the Genesis lifespan, and the first incarnation of EA's FIFA International Soccer wouldn't come out until over a year later, so its competition at the time wasn't great. The lack of any kind of published team stats or ratings really hurts the title, and that combined with the fact that the game's control system could definitely use some tightening makes me not want to play the game at all, which is unfortunate, because the 8-team tournament mode is a great idea and ahead of its time. I can see why Europeans went crazy for the original European Club Soccer, but this dumbed down American version is probably not going to convert anyone new to the sport. Okay, that was World Trophy Soccer. I'll probably eventually pick up European Club Soccer as well, just because I really want to see what it looks like with that crazy amount of teams. That might make for an interesting review as well, even though functionally it's the same game as World Trophy Soccer. We shall see. I'll have to find a copy first, but I don't think this one will be that hard to pick up off of British eBay. Tune in next week. I'm sticking with the Genesis again, but getting away from sports. Instead, I'm going with a recent pickup for the collection that was surprisingly hard to find complete. It's not terribly valuable, I think it just didn't sell very well due to the fact that it came out 4 years after the arcade machine it's based on. It's a pretty unique action driving game that I've got fond memories of playing in the arcades, especially at the local skating rink, and it was one of Atari's last hits. I'm curious to see how good this Genesis version is, and how well it translates to playing with a control pad. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.